February 1943, Tunisia. The desert was a theater of ruin and mirage. Wind carved ridges into the sand, whispering through the bones of machines left to rust. What had once been a confident column of Allied armor now lay broken across the ochre hills. Sherman tanks, their turrets blown open, stood silent in the sun, monuments to overconfidence. The smell of burned fuel lingered long after the fire was gone. Across that stillness, a thin dust trail began to rise, fragile, almost playful. Through the shimmering heat came a shape so small it seemed absurd. An open jeep, its canvas flapping in the wind. No armor, no gun. Just 4 men and a machine lighter than the sandstorm that chased it. German spotters, peering through binoculars, laughed. Amerikanische Spielzeugautos, they said. Toy cars on a battlefield built for steel giants. But the laughter did not last. The little vehicle swerved past craters, skipping over the dunes, weaving through the wreckage with a speed that seemed reckless, almost suicidal. It was not stopped by shell fire or fear. Within minutes, it had crossed ground that tanks would take hours to crawl through. It reached the front, delivered its message, and vanished again, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and confusion. In that fleeting act, something shifted. The war, which had worshipped armor and tonnage, now glimpsed a different kind of power, one that came from movement, not mass. The Jeep was no longer a curiosity, it was a revelation, a tool that turned vulnerability into velocity, exposure into advantage. As the desert sun fell and the shadows stretched across Kasserine, the laughter faded with it. What the Germans had dismissed as a toy had rewritten a law of modern war. Rewind to 1939. The United States Army, still anchored in the lessons of the last war, issued a request so ambitious it bordered on absurd. The specification called for a 1/4-ton light reconnaissance car, a vehicle that could carry 3 men, climb 60% grades, weigh less than 1,300 pounds, and survive the punishment of combat. In the bureaucratic language of procurement, it was a technical brief. In reality, it was a dare. No major manufacturer wanted to touch it. The requirements defied physics, and the deadline, 49 days to produce a working prototype, was nothing short of impossible. Yet in the offices of the Infantry Board, Major General W.G. Lee captured the spirit of the challenge in one dry sentence. "We need a horse that eats gasoline." The Army did not yet know what that meant, but it would soon. Only 2 small firms stepped forward. American Bantam of Butler, Pennsylvania, a struggling company born from the remnants of a failed British car venture, and Willis Overland, a modest automaker from Toledo, Ohio. For both, the project was not an opportunity. It was survival. The Depression had left them gasping for relevance. This contract was their final breath. At Bantam, engineers worked around the clock, drafting blueprints by hand, machining parts from scrap, sleeping on workshop floors. Their lead engineer, Karl Probst, joined the effort unpaid, a volunteer driven by pride and challenge. In just 45 days, the Blitz buggy was born, a squat, utilitarian machine that looked more like a metal toy than a military vehicle. When Bantam delivered it to Camp Holabird, Maryland, Army officers gathered in disbelief, and the little car leapt over ditches, clawed up slopes, and forded rivers without stalling. It did not just meet the Army's impossible demands, it exceeded them. Watching it tear through the mud, one observer muttered, "It looks ridiculous." Another whispered, "It might just work." In that moment, a quiet revolution began. It wasn't heralded by tanks or bombers, but by a box of steel and grease that could go anywhere men could walk. By late 1940, fragments of intelligence began to drift across German desks. whispers of a strange new vehicle in American testing grounds. Reports described a light car used for reconnaissance, a phrase so vague it invited ridicule. Within the walls of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, officers laughed. Unsuitable for the front, one wrote in the margin, it will die in the mud. To the German mind, war was a matter of weight and will. Their machines, the Panzer, the Tiger, the half-track, were the logical expressions of industrial precision and armored certainty. Every contour of their design reflected a philosophy: domination through engineering, control every variable, and victory would follow. Improvisation was chaos. Speed without armor was suicide. Across the Atlantic, another doctrine was forming, not written in manuals, but discovered in motion. The American army, untested and uncertain, began to see the battlefield differently. Victory would not come from immovable strength, but from relentless movement. The Jeep, small and unpretentious, became its symbol. Where tanks bogged down, it slipped through. Where supply lines faltered, it carried men, fuel, and messages. It was not built to impress, it was built to endure. Each one could be fixed with a wrench, started with a shove, and abandoned without regret. It was the democratization of mobility, a machine that turned every soldier into a scout. For every German vehicle that required a workshop, there were 10 Jeeps kept alive with wire and willpower. But Berlin never understood. Theirs was a culture that worshipped perfection. America's, one that trusted improvisation. That difference, invisible at first, would widen with every passing year. As one empire refined its machines to the edge of fragility, the other multiplied simplicity into strength. In the winter of 1940, in the industrial heart of Toledo, Ohio, the night shift never ended. The engineers of Willys Overland worked under the yellow hum of factory lights, surrounded by the smell of oil and steel. On their benches lay a handful of blueprints, sketches of a machine that was supposed to be impossible. Yet slowly, line by line, the impossible began to take shape. The Bantam design had proven the concept. Now Willys would refine it, strengthening the frame, widening the stance, and most importantly, building around an engine that defied its size. The Go Devil, a modest 4-cylinder producing just 60 horsepower, looked unremarkable on paper, but it pulled with stubborn persistence, refusing to quit even when burdened with double its weight. Mechanics learned to trust its growl, a low, unbroken rhythm that seemed to echo the will of the men who built it. Army testers tried to break it. They drove it through mud deep enough to drown a man, up frozen slopes slick with ice, through sand that swallowed trucks whole. The little vehicle simply refused to stop. When one sank into a swamp outside Holabird, a group of soldiers hauled it out, cranked it twice, and watched it lurch back to life. It was as if the machine had no memory of failure. Around this time, soldiers began giving it a name. Jeep. The word came from a Popeye cartoon, where Eugene the Jeep was a magical creature that could go anywhere and do anything. The name stuck, not as a joke, but as recognition. The machine carried men, stretchers, fuel, and even generals. It towed planes, mounted guns, and delivered mail. It was both tool and companion, the humble constant of a global war. To engineers, it was an act of quiet rebellion. Bureaucrats had dismissed it, generals had doubted it, yet here it was, simple, rugged, alive. Its design ignored perfection and embraced practicality. Every bolt was accessible, every panel replaceable. It was not a monument of engineering. It was a conversation between man and metal. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some officers called it a fad. Too light, they said. Too crude for real war. But the army had already seen enough. In July 1941, the order came through. Mass production. 600,000 units were to be built, a number so vast it would soon blur into history itself. No one in Toledo celebrated. They simply went back to work, tightening bolts, stamping steel, sending their creation into the unknown. In Germany, design was never merely mechanical, it was metaphysical. Every line, every bolt, every ounce of steel reflected a belief that precision was power, and that complexity, properly mastered, could conquer chaos. The factories of Stuttgart and Munich did not build tools. They built statements. The Tiger, the Panther, the Maybach, each was a monument to engineering perfection, a symphony of pistons and armor that promised dominance through discipline. At the center of this philosophy stood men like Ferdinand Porsche. To him, simplicity was not elegance, but inadequacy. He dreamed in intricacy, in the orchestration of hundreds of interlocking systems. His tanks weighed as much as small houses, their engines groaning under the weight of ambition. To the German mind, mastery meant control, of metal, of motion, of fate itself. Improvisation was the refuge of the unprepared. The Kübelwagen was their answer to the Jeep, a Volkswagen stripped down for the front. It was clever, undeniably so. Air-cooled, lightweight, and efficient, it carried officers through dust and snow with the same mechanical grace that characterized the Reich's machines. But where the Jeep had been born of urgency, the Kübelwagen was born of doctrine. It served the plan, not the moment. It was a fine instrument, but not a forgiving one. German officers called it a gentleman's car, clean, refined, orderly. The Jeep, by contrast, seemed primitive, even childish. "A toy," one colonel sneered, "for an army that does not understand war." The laughter was confident but hollow, for beneath the pride lay a blindness that would soon prove fatal. On paper, German vehicles outclassed everything the Allies possessed, but on the battlefield, perfection became a prison. The Tigers broke down under their own weight, their transmissions cracking in the Russian cold. Spare parts arrived too late, mechanics too few, and when the mud of the Eastern Front swallowed the roads, the Kübelwagen sat stranded, engines whirring uselessly as the simple, unassuming jeeps rolled past, splashing through the same filth that immobilized an empire. In that contrast, between brilliance and practicality, between arrogance and adaptation, lay the quiet hinge of the war's machinery. Germany's strength was its own illusion. Its genius could design anything except humility. By 1942, the Jeep had ceased to be an experiment. It had become a phenomenon, the most visible vehicle on the planet. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, from the frozen convoys of Murmansk to the beaches of the Pacific, one design appeared everywhere men fought. The same narrow hood, the same squared fenders, the same low growl of the Go Devil engine. No insignia was needed. Its shape alone was enough to mark it as Allied. In the burning sand of El Alamein, British crews used it to dash between artillery batteries, its tires cutting through dust like smoke. In Burma, the Chindits drove them through jungle paths that no road had ever known. In the Aleutians, it climbed snowbanks beneath the northern lights. It was not beautiful, but it was honest, the purest expression of necessity turned into motion. Winston Churchill, ever fond of machinery that served men rather than ruled them, called it the most vital tool in modern war. It was not a weapon, yet it carried more victory than many that were. In its open cabin rode the unglamorous faces of war, couriers, engineers, stretcher-bearers. It carried generals to the front and wounded men to safety. It towed anti-tank guns through mud and hauled priests to field chapels under shell fire. It did everything because it was built to do nothing in particular. Through the Lend-Lease program, thousands of Jeeps crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific, their olive frames lashed to cargo decks, their simple engines waiting for another ignition. In the Soviet Union, Red Army soldiers nicknamed it Bratishka, the little brother. They painted red stars over white US markings and drove them through the snows of Smolensk and Kursk. In photographs, they grinned beside it, hands on its thin steering wheel, as if embracing a friend that had somehow come from another world. Its power was paradoxical. It had no armor, no weight, no grandeur, yet it endured what others could not. Its weakness became its strength, the absence of pretension, the acceptance of imperfection. It did not resist the world. It adapted to it, and through that adaptability, it conquered terrain that empires could not. In Berlin, the laughter had stopped. German intelligence now filed reports on the American light utility car, noting its ubiquity, its versatility, its unnerving simplicity. Engineers were told to study it. Officers began to wonder how something so small, so crude, could move armies faster than their own tanks. The Jeep had crossed oceans, bridged doctrines, and humbled perfection. It was no longer just a vehicle, it was a philosophy made real. Motion over mastery, purpose over pride. November 8, 1942. Operation Torch. Dawn rises over the Moroccan coast. A pale, hesitant light brushing against the surf as Allied landing craft grind toward the beaches. Before the tanks, before the artillery, before the weight of invasion arrives, something smaller touches the sand first. A handful of Jeeps, their engines muffled by sea spray, their crews crouched low behind windshields, cut flat against the horizon. The first wheels of liberation. They move like insects across the shore, darting, pausing, vanishing into the dunes. Where heavier machines stall in the wet sand, the Jeeps climb out, light and tireless. Reconnaissance teams drive inland, radios crackling through the static. They ford rivers the tanks avoid, roll under radar nets, and reappear miles away. For the first time, commanders begin to see war unfold in real time. The battlefield, not as a map, but as a living landscape. Each Jeep becomes an extension of its driver. The men modify them endlessly, improvising with the ease of field soldiers who understand that necessity is the truest engineer. Stretchers are bolted to frames for the wounded. Radio sets fill the back seats, antennas whipping in the wind. Others mount Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, turning their little vehicles into fast, brutal escorts. No two Jeeps are alike. Each bears the fingerprint of its crew, practical, inventive, and personal. In the dust of North Africa, they earn new names: Peep, Blitz Buggy, Light Recon Car. But to those who drive them, they are simply lifelines, the one machine that always starts, always moves, always returns. The Jeep becomes the cavalry of a new age, replacing the horse with horsepower and the saber with a steering wheel. By the summer of 1943, the war rolls north into Sicily. The roads are narrow, the bridges bombed, and the mountains treacherous. Yet through every pass and ravine, the same small vehicles lead the way. In the photographs of that campaign, one figure stands out: General George S. Patton, sitting upright in the passenger seat of a Jeep, goggles hanging from his neck, map spread across his knees. His driver, silent and steady, takes the machine where no staff car could go. Dust rises around them like a halo of command. Patton loved speed, and the Jeep gave it to him. It gave every commander what the horse once did: eyes and legs at once. "A general without a Jeep," one officer remarked, "is blind." The phrase was no exaggeration. In the chaos of moving fronts, the Jeep turned strategy into motion. Orders no longer waited for secure roads or radio towers. They arrived in person through a storm of dust and exhaust. In Italy, jeeps scaled mountains to deliver supplies to units isolated by winter snow. In the Pacific, they floated ashore on pontoons, their engines wrapped in plastic sheeting. They ran across coral sand and jungle mud with the same stubborn rhythm. In every theater, their purpose multiplied. Ambulance, command post, machine gun platform, messenger. It seemed there was nothing the little machine couldn't do, and no place it couldn't reach. The Jeep's genius was that it made itself invisible, an instrument so small and reliable that no one stopped to marvel at it. Yet behind every advance, every push inland, every line of communication kept alive, there it was, the same squat silhouette against the horizon, the same unassuming growl of its "Go Devil" heart. In Morocco, a British observer wrote, "They appear out of nowhere, like ghosts with wheels." He meant it as wonder, but he was closer to truth than he knew. The Jeep had become the invisible thread binding armies together, weaving through chaos with quiet purpose. War rewards those who adapt faster than it destroys. Behind every Jeep that rolled across the world, there was a soldier's idea, small, improvised, and ingenious. The flat hood became a table for maps, or a stretcher for the wounded. Windshields were sawn off to reduce glare. Jerry cans lined the sides, packed with fuel and water for journeys far beyond their design. Some mounted racks of grenades, others welded machine guns on the fenders. What began as a factory model quickly became a living organism, reshaped by every hand that drove it. In the jungles of Burma, that adaptability became a lifeline. Major General Ord Wingate's Chindits, deep penetration units operating hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines, depended entirely on movement. No supply road, no fixed base, only the green maze of the jungle and the machines they brought with them. The Jeep, stripped of excess weight and loaded with fuel, became their mule, their ambulance, their gun platform. Mechanics removed body panels to lighten them further. They climbed paths cut by machete, forded rivers in silence, and when a bridge collapsed, were hauled across by rope and manpower. Photographs show them coated in mud, vines hanging from their frames, drivers in torn shirts steering with bare hands. They looked nothing like the sleek machines of the assembly line. Yet in that filth lay their perfection. Each Jeep carried the logic of the soldier, not the engineer. Simple, direct, and utterly focused on survival. The Chindits campaign would test the endurance of men and machine alike. When fuel ran low, Jeeps were cannibalized for parts. When tires burst, they were wrapped in burlap and pushed onward. The lesson was not technological, but human. Ingenuity could outlast supply. Across the desert, the same principle turned into something deadlier. The Special Air Service and the Long-Range Desert Group, small, irregular units born from necessity, took the Jeep and remade it into a weapon. They stripped off windshields and doors, replaced seats with ammunition racks, and mounted twin Vickers K machine guns on pivoting mounts. At dawn, they descended on German airfields and supply convoys, engines throttled low, silhouettes invisible against the dunes. By the time the alarm sounded, the raiders were already gone, leaving smoke and silence behind. To the Axis, these attacks were baffling. They came from nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished before pursuit began. German intelligence began referring to them as Geisterwagen, ghost trucks. They were fast enough to escape, light enough to hide, and cheap enough to lose without hesitation. For every expensive vehicle Germany built, the Allies countered with 100 Jeeps carrying improvisation and willpower. Each field modification, every welded bracket, every spare tire bolted to the hood, told a story of adaptation. The Jeep was not a fixed machine, but a canvas for necessity. Where doctrine failed, creativity filled the void. In North Africa, raiders painted them sand beige to blend into the dunes. In Italy, they draped camouflage nets over the hoods. In the Pacific, they waterproofed their engines and fitted bamboo mats for traction. Even generals took note. "Give a man a Jeep," one officer wrote, "and he will invent his own war." In time, the Jeep's flexibility became psychological. It was no longer just a transport. It was a message. It told friend and foe alike that the Allied armies could move anywhere, appear any time, and strike from directions no map predicted. The machine's modesty became its disguise, its simplicity, its camouflage. By 1943, the Germans no longer mocked it. Reports from the Africa Corps warned that light Allied cars were infiltrating lines under cover of night, directing artillery and ambushing convoys. They called them phantoms, because to those who met them, they seemed to come from the sand itself. What began as an unarmored utility car had become a symbol of fluid warfare, of men who fought with imagination as much as firepower. In an age obsessed with design and doctrine, the Jeep proved that victory often belonged not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. When the Jeep first rolled from its factory floor, it was a miracle of improvisation. By 1942, it became something rarer, a miracle of organization. The machine that began as a sketch and a gamble was now an industrial gospel, copied, standardized, and perfected until every bolt had meaning. It was no longer one company's creation, it was America's. In early 1942, Ford Motor Company joined Willys Overland in full-scale production. Henry Ford's engineers brought with them the discipline of mass manufacture, the art of turning chaos into rhythm. Every component, from the spark plug to the steering column, was made to be identical across factories. A bolt from Detroit would fit a frame from Toledo. A windshield from Dearborn would mount perfectly on a Jeep built in Philadelphia. It was a language of precision, spoken fluently across an entire continent. By 1944, that language had spread to the world. More than 50 factories in the United States, Canada, Australia, and beyond produced Jeep parts in synchronized motion. Crates left American ports marked not with flags, but with serial numbers and instructions. Inside each, a disassembled Jeep, packed like a puzzle, waiting for hands to bring it to life. Soldiers in England and India learned to assemble them in the field, using only basic tools. 2 men, a wrench, and a few hours. That was all it took to create mobility. Even its manual reflected that same philosophy. The Jeep's maintenance guide was written in plain English, illustrated with clean line drawings, stripped of jargon. It was designed for the ordinary soldier, the farmhand, the mechanic, the apprentice. In a war defined by complexity, the Jeep remained readable. It could be fixed by torchlight, repaired with spare wire, revived with water when oil ran dry. There was a quiet democracy in its design, the idea that technology should serve its user, not intimidate him. Meanwhile, Germany's factories fought a different kind of war. Their tanks grew heavier, their engines more intricate, their logistics slower. The Tiger, a masterpiece of steel and ambition, required nearly 10 times the labor of a single Jeep. When one broke down, and many did, the parts were too specialized, the repairs too long. German engineers built monuments to perfection. American engineers built tools for endurance. This contrast became a kind of philosophy. The Jeep's simplicity wasn't a limitation, it was a weapon. Every interchangeable part, every shared bolt, was a line of communication made faster. It allowed armies to move with the same reliability as the machine itself. Logistics became poetry, not in grandeur, but in flow. The Jeep didn't just carry soldiers, it carried the idea that the simplest path was often the most powerful. In the Pacific, Jeeps arrived in crates, unloaded from Liberty ships, assembled on the beach, and driven straight into combat. In Europe, replacement parts traveled faster than ammunition. Mechanics joked that the Jeep was the only vehicle that could be destroyed and reborn within a day. The humor was not far from truth. By the time the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, nearly 500,000 Jeeps had been built, each one identical, each one essential. Their numbers blurred into myth, countless small machines stitched together into the fabric of victory. While Germany's war engines groaned under the weight of complexity, America's rolled forward on repetition. The Jeep became proof that strength could exist without spectacle, that utility itself could be beautiful. June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks gray and cold over the French coast. For hours the horizon has thundered with ships, thousands of them, each disgorging men, steel, and fear onto beaches already black with smoke. The air smells of salt and cordite. The surf, thick with oil and debris, glints under a pale sun that seems reluctant to rise. The invasion of Europe has begun. Among the chaos of landing craft, one shape repeats itself. Small, square, and unarmored. Jeeps roll down ramps into waist-deep water, engines hissing as salt spray hits hot steel. They come by the hundreds, then the thousands, pushing through the wreckage of tanks and trucks that have failed to reach the shore. Soldiers steer them like lifeboats through a sea of noise, weaving between obstacles, hauling ammunition, carrying stretchers. They are the first machines to move freely on ground that has swallowed everything heavier. On the beaches of Normandy, movement itself becomes the rarest commodity. Tanks bog down in sand, half-tracks spin their wheels. But the Jeep, light and tireless, climbs over shell holes, through barbed wire, and onto the roads beyond. For every ton of armor that falters, a half-ton of steel on 4 simple wheels keeps advancing. They ferry officers to command posts, dispatch riders to the front, and medics to the wounded. A machine built for reconnaissance now becomes the artery of invasion. In the bocage country, behind the beaches, where thick hedgerows turn every field into a fortress, the Jeep adapts again. Crews weld steel bars to their bumpers, hedge cutters, they call them, and slice through the walls of Normandy's ancient fields. What was once farmland becomes a maze of green corridors. Heavy armor crawls. The Jeep flows. German commanders note it bitterly in their reports. They move like water. From the first hours of the landings to the long slog toward Caen, the Jeep carries the war on its narrow back. It hauls ammunition to forward positions under fire. It brings generals forward to see what no radio can describe. It carries the wounded to the rear, a simple stretcher lashed across the hood, wind in the patient's face, engine humming beneath. Its noise becomes the sound of continuity, the pulse of an army that refuses to stop. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later name it one of the 3 tools that won the war, alongside the C-47 transport plane and the bazooka. The irony was sharp. The smallest of the 3, the least armed, had carried the most. It had no armor, no gun of its own, no glamour. And yet without it, even the grandest machines of war would have stood still. For the men who drove it, the Jeep became a kind of reassurance, a constant presence amid the shifting front. Its canvas seats were worn smooth by sweat and sand. Its steering wheel, thin and utilitarian, fit like a handshake. Some painted names on the hood: Liberty Bell, Lucky 7, Faithful. Others left it plain, knowing that sentiment belonged to men, not machines. Yet when they climbed aboard, there was comfort in the familiar rattle of the engine, the way it always started, a sound of normalcy in a world that had forgotten it. To the Germans, the Jeep represented something deeper than mobility. It was a philosophy they had dismissed: speed over armor, adaptability over perfection. They had laughed once, in the deserts of Tunisia, at the little toy car that dared to enter their war. But by 1944, that laughter had faded into recognition. This was not a toy. It was the shape of modern war, small, simple, and everywhere. In Normandy's hedgerows, a new truth emerged, one that would define the rest of the century. Power no longer belonged to the largest machine, but to the one that moved first, repaired fastest, and never stopped. December 1944. The last great gamble of the Reich begins under a winter sky. Snow falls thick across the Ardennes, a white silence that hides the thunder beneath. In the forests of Belgium, entire divisions are swallowed by fog. Roads vanish, engines freeze, the temperature falls below -10, and through that stillness comes chaos. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. For the Allies, it is a season of confusion. Lines bend and blur, messages vanish into the storm, convoys lose their way, artillery shells echo without direction. It is a battle fought not just against an enemy, but against the cold itself. Yet one machine refuses to stop. The same one that once bounced through desert dunes now crawls across ice. Its small tires dig through the snow, chains biting at frozen ground. The Jeep, never armored, never pampered, becomes the lifeline of an army under siege. In the dark woods outside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division digs in, surrounded by German armor on all sides. Supply lines are severed, the roads are death traps. Larger trucks, immobilized by snow and fuel shortages, stand abandoned. But the Jeeps keep moving. Their drivers wrap scarves over their faces, gloved hands stiff on the wheel, headlights blacked out to avoid detection. They carry ammunition, plasma, food, everything the besieged paratroopers need to hold. One load of bandages, one case of shells, one wounded man at a time. At night, the sound of their engines becomes a rhythm of reassurance, that low, steady hum somewhere in the distance. Soldiers huddle near them for warmth, running engines through the night so frost won't seize the pistons. When no tents remain, the Jeeps become shelters. Men curl beneath their tarps, wrapped in blankets, rifles across their knees, trusting the little machine to keep the cold away. German tanks, designed for speed and terror, struggle here. Their fuel thickens like syrup, treads lock, engines stall. The mighty panthers and tigers stand silent in the snow, mechanical giants frozen mid-stride. The irony is cruel and complete. The toy cars, once mocked for their weakness, now glide past the hulks of machines, once feared as invincible. In reports from the front, German officers admit a grim respect. The enemy's leichtes Auto, the light car, moves through terrain no panzer can cross. It carries dispatches faster than runners, ammunition faster than trains. It appears where no road exists and disappears before counterfire arrives. The advantage of perfection is gone. Simplicity has survived. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne still holds. Its defenders are exhausted, half-frozen, but alive. Their survival owes as much to willpower as to a handful of small, stubborn vehicles that refuse to fail. Mechanics work by lantern light to keep them running, draining oil, thawing carburetors over open flames, welding with bare hands. Each Jeep that returns from the snow carries more than supplies. It carries the message that the line still stands. The soldiers who once cursed its stiffness now speak of it with reverence. It is no longer just transportation, it is endurance given shape. In a war of machines, it has become human, flawed, battered, but unbreakable. When the skies finally clear and Allied aircraft return, The men of Bastogne watch the first drops of supplies from above. The jeeps are waiting on the roads below, engines idling, ready to move again. Even as the snow deepens, they start on the first turn. In that frozen December, the jeep completes its quiet transformation, from a prototype of practicality to a symbol of survival. The laughter that once followed it across deserts and seas has long since frozen, buried beneath snow and silence. Spring, 1945. Europe is a ruin waking from its nightmare. Cities once carved in stone now lie open to the sky. Cathedrals without roofs, boulevards without names. The thunder of war is fading, replaced by the hum of engines. And among them, always, is one familiar sound, the low, even rhythm of the jeep. They roll through Rome, through Paris, through Berlin. The same design that crossed deserts and jungles, now threading through the wreckage of empires. Soldiers sit behind their narrow wheels, helmets tilted back, faces hollow with exhaustion. In the back seats ride chaplains, medics, photographers, even prisoners. The vehicle that once carried generals now carries surrender. The jeep, always neutral in purpose, moves on, indifferent to triumph or defeat. In Rome, it becomes a pulpit. Priests stand in the back, giving mass to crowds of refugees gathered in the ruins of plazas. The sound of prayer mingles with the idling of engines, the sacred and the mechanical, sharing the same air. In Paris, it becomes a parade car. Flags drape across its hood as liberators drive down the Champs-Élysées. People climb onto its fenders, cheering, waving, throwing flowers. For many, this is the first Allied vehicle they have ever touched. Liberation, it seems, has 4 wheels and a steel heartbeat. In Berlin, it becomes irony made real. German officers, captured in the chaos of retreat, are transported in the very machine their armies once mocked. The symbol of what they dismissed, too light, too crude, too American, now carries them into captivity. No tank escorts them, no grand machine of conquest, just the little car they once called a toy. War photographers capture it all. Jeeps crossing bridges of rubble, soldiers standing on hoods beneath ruined arches, children perched beside machine guns now gone quiet. Their photographs travel the world, printed in newspapers and hung in barracks. And in nearly all of them, somewhere in the frame, the jeep is there, part of the composition of victory, as constant as the men who drove it. For the soldiers, it becomes personal. They carve names into dashboards. Mary Lou, Faith, Home Soon. Some paint hometowns on the bumpers. Others hang helmets from the mirrors. The jeep, once a tool, becomes a diary of steel and dust, a record of journeys no map could contain. It has carried them through mud, snow, and fire, through doubt and deliverance. When the fighting ends, many find it impossible to leave behind. In the final weeks of the war, jeeps serve as ambulances, command cars, hearses. They deliver surrender terms, carry medics through minefields, tow planes across abandoned airstrips. On VE Day, they drive through London and New York, their olive paint dulled, but their engines still faithful. Children climb onto their hoods, tugging at the worn ropes, laughing as if to test whether joy itself can move on 4 wheels. And then, as silence returns to Europe, the little machines keep working. They rebuild where they once destroyed. They pull debris, haul timber, carry bread and doctors into villages where no road remains. In the hands of relief workers and farmers, the jeep becomes something purer, the machinery of recovery. It is once again what it always was, a servant of movement. By war's end, more than 640,000 jeeps have been built. They have outlived campaigns, commanders, even the nations that made them. Empires rose, collided, and broke apart, yet the jeep endured, unglamorous but indispensable. It taught armies to think smaller, to move faster, to trust ingenuity over intimidation. It was proof that the tools of survival often begin as the humblest of inventions. The war does not end with a roar, but with that quiet engine, idling somewhere in the dust of victory, waiting for one more order, one more road. 1945. The war is over, but its machinery remains. Across the bombed-out towns of Europe, in fields where shells once bloomed, the engines of war fall silent, and then, slowly, start again. Not in battle, but in labor. In the years of rebuilding that follow, a strange sight spreads across the continent. The Jeep, its olive paint fading, its tires worn smooth, now hauling wood instead of weapons, seed instead of soldiers. In Poland, farmers buy them from surplus depots by the dozen. They drive them through mud and frost, pulling plows where horses once stood. In France, police and firefighters adopt them, repainting them blue and red, still trusting their stubborn engines to start on the first turn. In Italy, they carry doctors to mountain villages, priests to ruined churches, school teachers to towns that no longer appear on maps. What was built for conquest becomes an instrument of recovery. It is perhaps the Jeep's greatest transformation, from tool of war to servant of peace. The same traits that made it invaluable in combat now make it indispensable in rebuilding. It is light, it is simple, it does not ask for perfection. With minimal care, it runs forever. Soldiers return home, and many find they miss its simplicity. For some, it had been a companion, uncomplaining, alive, mechanical proof that perseverance can have form and sound. In 1945, Willys Overland recognizes this. From its factories in Toledo comes a new version, barely changed, the CJ, short for civilian Jeep. It keeps the same frame, the same engine, even the same blunt lines, as if to remind the world that utility itself can be beautiful. The advertisements call it a power for peace, a phrase that rings truer than any marketing slogan. Farmers in Kansas buy it for the fields. Explorers take it into jungles. Builders, ranchers, and surveyors claim it as their own. The machine that carried armies now carries ordinary life. In its modest rebirth lies a quiet philosophy. The Jeep teaches that durability is a kind of democracy, that technology need not belong only to engineers or generals, but to everyone who works, drives, repairs, and depends on it. It is mechanical equality, forged in war, repurposed for peace. Across the ruins of Germany, the contrast is striking. The great engines of the Reich, the Tigers, the Maybachs, the Kubelwagens, vanish almost overnight. Too complex, too fragile, too costly for the new world they helped destroy. Their spare parts are gone, their factories bombed, their purpose obsolete. They had been machines of power. The Jeep is a machine of endurance, and endurance is what remains when power collapses. By the late 1940s, the sight of the Jeep has become universal. It is as much a symbol of the post-war world as it was of victory. In Africa, it crosses plains where no road has ever been built. In Asia, it becomes the first motor vehicle many remote villages ever see. It drives aid workers through flood zones, explorers across tundra, and photographers into history's next frontier. Its endurance is no longer just mechanical, it is moral. War gave it purpose. Peace gave it meaning. In its survival, there is a kind of redemption. The same hands that once mounted guns now fit it with trailers, tools, and seed drills. Where its tires once crushed, they now cultivate. It is a transformation so complete that it feels almost human, a symbol of how civilization itself can adapt when stripped to its essentials. And as the decades unfold, the Jeep's descendants continue to carry that lesson. Through every generation, The world reaffirms what its engineers once discovered in desperation, that perfection isn't precision, it's endurance, the ability to persist when the grand designs have failed, to move when others freeze, to rebuild from what remains. In the quiet aftermath of defeat, when the noise of engines has faded and the weight of history settles, Germany begins to reflect. The interviews that follow the war, with engineers, officers, and planners of the once mighty Wehrmacht, carry the same tone, resignation mixed with respect. Beneath the formal phrasing and technical language, one admission repeats itself. We underestimated it. They speak of the small American car that appeared everywhere, in mud, in snow, in the chaos of retreat. They remember watching it weave between broken trucks and immobilized tanks, moving with a kind of careless inevitability. One officer, recalling the winter of 1944, says quietly, "Our engines froze, theirs did not." It is not bitterness, but wonder, the tone of men who have discovered too late that victory had not belonged to those with the heaviest machines, but to those with the simplest. At post-war tribunals and technical reviews, engineers who once built the pride of the Reich, the Tigers, the Panthers, the armored convoys, now sit beneath Allied questioning. When asked about the Jeep, many smile ruefully. Ferdinand Porsche himself, whose genius gave birth to both masterpieces and monstrosities, concedes that simplicity was the truest form of genius. It is easier, he admits, to make something complicated than something perfect. The statement could have been an epitaph, not only for a machine, but for an era. The Kübelwagen, Germany's counterpart to the Jeep, had been clever but constrained. Its air-cooled engine, its rear-wheel drive, elegant in theory, but insufficient in the mud and ruin of real war. It had served well enough in the early campaigns, when roads were smooth and victory swift. But as the front stretched, as winters deepened and supply lines cracked, its limits became fatal. It was a design that obeyed doctrine, not necessity. The Jeep, by contrast, answered to no doctrine. It evolved with its users. Every soldier became its designer. Every battlefield its proving ground. It was a democratic machine in an age of hierarchy, and in that quiet irony lay the essence of its triumph. It embodied the adaptability of the very society that produced it. The Germans had engineered machines to dominate. The Americans had built one to serve. As West Germany rebuilt, the lesson took root in steel. In the 1950s, under NATO integration, the new Bundeswehr studied American mobility doctrine, fast, flexible, modular. They learned that movement was not merely mechanical, but strategic, the art of turning simplicity into advantage. German factories, once devoted to complexity, began to produce light vehicles modeled on the American pattern, the DK-Jubiläumwagen, the later Volkswagen Type 181, all descendants in spirit of the little car they had once mocked. It was an irony so sharp that even former officers acknowledged it openly. "We laughed at the toy," one wrote, "and we ended by imitating it." What began as a point of arrogance had become a national lesson in humility. For all the grandeur of German design, it was the unassuming Jeep that had shaped the modern military. It taught armies that mobility was not measured in horsepower, but in persistence, in how quickly a machine could adapt, repair, and continue. Over time, the Kübelwagen faded from memory, remembered only in museums and manuals. The Jeep endured, not as a relic, but as a survivor. By the 1960s, its descendants patrolled every continent. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Sinai, it became the universal language of movement, its form unchanged because its purpose remained pure. It was a design that needed no translation. In Germany, scholars studying the war began to see the Jeep as a metaphor. It was the embodiment of the flaw that had undone them, the pursuit of control at the cost of adaptability. In every field, they saw echoes of the same truth. The smaller, simpler idea had outlasted the grander one. The laughter of 1939, the easy confidence of those who thought they understood progress, now echoed as a lesson in humility. It was the sound of engineers realizing that the future does not belong to the flawless, but to the functional. In a quiet hall of a military museum, beneath soft light and the hush of reverence, sits an old Jeep. Its paint, once olive drab, has faded to the color of memory. The metal bears dents from shrapnel and years of hands that turned its wheel. A faint smell of oil lingers, not from neglect, but from history that refuses to fade. It is small, unassuming, surrounded by giants, tanks, artillery, aircraft, yet somehow it draws every gaze, because those who know war understand that this was the machine that never stopped moving. There is no vanity in its design, no armor to boast of, no weapon to display. Its beauty lies in absence, the absence of excess, of pride, of pretense. It was built only to move, and in that purpose, it achieved perfection. Soldiers who once rode in it say the same thing in different words. It never boasted, it never failed, and it never rested. Its story is not one of glory, but of endurance, of movement turned into philosophy. It began as a desperate idea on a drawing board, a light reconnaissance car in an army that didn't yet know how to fight a modern war. Yet in its steel frame was something prophetic, a belief that adaptability is stronger than armor, and that simplicity, when tested, can outlast complexity. Through deserts and jungles, through snow and storm, it taught the same lesson to everyone who drove it. The Jeep did not conquer terrain, it accepted it. It did not defy nature, it worked with it. It carried men not because it was strong, but because it was faithful. And in that humility, it changed how armies thought about movement itself. For every soldier it carried, it represented something larger than transport. It was freedom, not just of distance, but of thought, the ability to go anywhere, to improvise, to decide. When generals rode it, they saw the front for themselves. When medics drove it, they brought the wounded home. When paratroopers huddled inside it under frozen skies, they found warmth in its steady heart. History remembers the tanks, the planes, the ships, the grand machinery of empires, but it remembers the Jeep, because its story was never about domination, it was about endurance. It didn't change the balance of firepower, it changed the rhythm of war. Even now, decades later, restorers keep them running. Farmers drive them through fields once scarred by trenches. Veterans, now gray and slow, still recognize the sound of its engine from half a mile away, that distinct, unwavering hum that once meant rescue, or orders, or home. The world that built it has moved on, but its lesson remains, that the simplest designs often carry the deepest truths. The Jeep was never meant to be immortal, yet it became timeless. It crossed not just continents, but ideologies. It served armies and civilians, victors and vanquished, engineers and dreamers. It was proof that genius need not be grand, only honest. In the end, the Jeep outlived the empires it served and the arrogance that dismissed it. It endured because it was built without pride, and that made it invincible.